Ethan gripped his father's sleeve in the glittering banquet hall, his worn sneakers lost against gleaming marble. He looked up and whispered, barely a sound, almost trembling, "Asterisk. We don't belong here, Dad. Asterisk." Before Andrew could answer, footsteps behind them stopped. A woman in an elegant black dress had heard everything. And what would silence the room wasn't that she was the company's CEO, it was the look she gave the two of them, as if she had just recognized something everyone else had been too blind to see. Andrew Foster crouched down, straightened the collar of Ethan's button-down with both hands, and said quietly but without hesitation, "You don't need to belong to this room. You just need to make sure it doesn't get to decide who you are." Ethan looked at him for a second, measuring the sincerity the way children who have been disappointed by promises learn to measure things. Then he nodded, and they walked forward together. Sophia Reeves had come down from the mezzanine level and was headed toward the ballroom when something in the exchange made her pause. Not the words exactly, but the register of them, the way the man had not bent down to offer the boy false comfort, but had said the thing as though it were simply true. She stood still and observed. The man wore a blazer that fit him well, but was a season past current cut. The boy beside him was 12 or so, dark-eyed, reading the room with the practiced attention of a child who had lived close enough to the edge of things to know the math of a situation before it resolved. Neither of them looked lost. That was the detail Sophia filed away. They knew exactly where they were. They just were not pretending it was comfortable. A moment later, an event coordinator materialized at the father's elbow and asked, with precision politeness, whether they had perhaps come in through the wrong entrance. The man reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, not a phone, not a screenshot, and held it forward without a word until the coordinator had no choice but to read it. His expression did not change. He did not apologize for being there. Sophia walked on. The evening was full of people who performed certainty. This was the first one she had seen who simply carried it. Andrew Foster was 34 years old, and what most people reading his surface would have seen was a maintenance technician on a short-term contract at a mid-rise office building. They would have missed the engineering coursework he had nearly completed before his father's death pulled him out of school at 21. They would have missed the night classes he had resumed 7 years later, and the 3 semesters he had completed before Ethan's respiratory condition, bad enough that the medical bills and missed shifts had overwhelmed. Everything else had ended that chapter too. They would have missed the 4 years he had spent at a systems integration company handling commercial AV and building control infrastructure, work he understood past procedure and into instinct, until a family leave request during Ethan's worst illness had translated, upon his return, into a position that no longer existed. His ex-wife Dana had left 3 years before the job did. Andrew did not elaborate on the reasons to Ethan, and he did not speak badly of her. What he kept, through all of it, was a disciplined quiet. Not the grinding, performed suffering of a man who wanted credit for endurance, but the organizational calm of someone who had learned to treat every resource as finite and every system, personal or mechanical, as something worth understanding from the inside. The letter from the Reeves Foundation had arrived 6 weeks ago. Ethan had been selected for a small academic support grant from the consortium's Community Scholarship Fund. Families were welcome at the recognition ceremony. Andrew had looked up the hotel online and stared at the image of its lobby for a long time before he told Ethan about it. Ethan was 12, and had been 12 in the way that some children are 12, already carrying more awareness of where he stood in the world than any 12-year-old should need, already fluent in the unspoken language of who belonged, where, and what the consequences were for getting it wrong. He had been mocked once for the food in his lunch bag, and had never quite stopped eating quickly after that. He had a habit of identifying emergency exits in rooms he entered, not because of physical fear, but because of a deeper, earlier acquired anxiety about being somewhere he might suddenly be asked to leave. He was also, when his guard was down, the funniest and most perceptive person Andrew had ever spent time with. Andrew had decided they would go, because he wanted his son to understand that spaces like this were not reserved for people unlike them. He had been right that it would be uncomfortable. He was still holding on to the hope that it would be worth it. The ceremony room held perhaps 30 families. 2/3 of them occupied the space with ease. The remaining third worked hard to conceal that they were working hard. Andrew and Ethan were in the second group, though Andrew's version of it was quieter than most. A woman in a burgundy blazer moved through the room with a tablet, cross-referencing names. When she reached them, she paused, scrolled, and offered the specific apology that is not quite apology. There's a discrepancy on our list. We have the name Evan Foster. Ethan, Andrew said. He unlocked his phone and pulled up the confirmation email from 6 weeks ago. He handed it to her without elaboration, the way you hand someone the answer to a question they should already have. His name is Ethan. The confirmation number is in the subject line. The foundation contact who processed the application was named Marcia. The woman read. She nodded. She moved to confer with a colleague. Sophia had slipped in through the back of the room 3 minutes earlier. She watched from near the doorway and recognized what she was seeing. A man who, when confronted with bureaucratic inconvenience in an environment already loaded with class anxiety, had done neither of the predictable things. He had not deflated into apology, and he had not inflated into performance. He had produced the evidence, stated the facts, and waited. The program director, Gerald, was already moving toward Andrew, with the specific energy of someone about to suggest the evening continue without them, when Sophia stepped forward and said, to Gerald, that if the Foundation's database had a transcription error in a recipient's name, that was a Foundation error, and it would be corrected before the program continued. Gerald corrected the name. Ethan crossed the small stage and received his certificate. When he came back down the steps, Andrew put one hand briefly on the back of the boy's neck and said, low enough that only Ethan heard, "You see? You don't need to make noise to deserve something." Ethan looked at the certificate. Something in his face loosened for the first time all evening. Sophia, from the back of the room, leaned to her assistant. "Find out who that man is." The cocktail portion of the evening occupied a long hall off the main ballroom, louder and more performative, calibrated toward the size of its donors. They should have left after the ceremony. Andrew had intended to, but Ethan had looked at the lit doorway with something that was not quite wanting but was not nothing either, and so they had stayed. A man named Douglas Hale, one of the evening's major contributors, stood 20 feet away with his own son, a boy, a year older than Ethan, blazer and school crest. Douglas said something that Andrew could not hear, and his son laughed. Then Douglas glanced at Andrew's jacket, with the flat, brief appraisal of a man pricing something second-hand, and said audibly that the Foundation was to be commended for the breadth of its outreach, though combined formats like this one did create certain awkward adjacencies. Ethan looked at the floor. Andrew felt his son's shoulder shift inward and steered them both, quietly, toward the side corridor. They were almost to it, when the sound in the hall changed. 3 technical crew members were hunched over a control panel in the stage wing, one of them speaking rapidly into a phone. The large projection screen behind the podium flickered with a slow, rhythmic instability, not off, but cycling through a ghost of the scheduled content before dropping and recovering. The keynote segment, in which the year's largest grant would be announced before international partners and press, was scheduled to begin in 11 minutes. Andrew stopped walking. He looked at the screen. He looked at the indicator lights on the switching unit visible from his angle, 2 amber where they should have been green, one cycling between both in a pattern he recognized immediately. He stepped close to a young technician holding a radio and looking lost. "Your signal distributor is the problem, not the display," Andrew said, keeping his voice low. "The failover on the secondary power block is misreading a ground reference. It's cycling because the building management system was updated in the fall and changed the shared circuit parameters. Every time you reset the main screen, you're triggering the failover again. The fault is in the sub-source cluster." The technician looked at Andrew's jacket. Then he looked at the laminated guest pass hanging at Andrew's breast pocket, the general entry card issued to scholarship families at the front desk. "Sir, this area is for technical staff." A senior technician appeared at his shoulder and guided Andrew away with the economy of someone who has decided a conversation is finished. Andrew did not argue. He walked with Ethan toward the corridor, and before they reached it, he turned back once and said, at a volume the senior technician could hear clearly, "If you keep resetting the screen, instead of isolating the distributor at the secondary source cluster, the whole stage system goes dark in about 5 minutes." Then he walked on. 5 minutes later, it went dark. Not flickering dark. The ambient audio dropped with it. The keynote was 4 minutes away. The international delegation was seated in the front row. Sophia heard the shift in the room behind her and turned. The technical team was moving in the disorganized, escalating way that meant no one had the answer. The younger technician was pointing toward the corridor where Andrew had gone and saying something about the distributor, about the secondary source cluster, about how he said it before we sent him away. Sophia crossed the hall in under 30 seconds. Andrew and Ethan were near the lobby entrance, Ethan's jacket half off one shoulder. Sophia stopped 2 feet away and did not perform urgency. "I think you identified the problem," she said. "If you're right, I need to hear it. We have 8 minutes." Andrew looked at her. He had placed her vaguely as the woman who had intervened about Ethan's name. "I have my son here. I know." He looked at Ethan, who was watching the exchange with arms still crossed, reading it. Sophia glanced at the boy. "Would you be willing to wait in the side office for a few minutes? There's a desk and a very good view of people panicking, if that helps." Ethan blinked. The corners of his mouth moved. Andrew said, "What do you need from me?" At the technical station, he asked for a signal routing diagram and got it in 90 seconds. 3 questions. Installation date of the distributor unit, whether the secondary cluster had shared a circuit since last August, whether anyone had run a failover test since the fall building management update. The answers confirmed everything. "The BMS update changed the ground reference on the shared circuit," he said. "The distributor's failover logic is reading it as a live fault and trying to reroute to a backup that isn't configured. You need to isolate the distributor from the secondary cluster, bypass the failover module manually, and cold start the signal chain from the primary source." He did not touch anything until the credentialed technician confirmed authorization. Source isolation first, module bypass second, startup chain third. The screen came back. The audio followed. The indicator lights went green in sequence, and the hall's ambient sound returned, and the room exhaled. No one applauded immediately. The silence was the kind that forms when you have been wrong about a person and have not yet rearranged your understanding of them. Andrew stepped back from the panel. He looked across the hall through the side office glass and found Ethan pressed against it watching his father with an expression Andrew had not seen before. Not pride reflecting a parent's success, but something closer to recognition, as though something suspected privately, in the quiet of the apartment, had just been confirmed by a room full of strangers. Andrew crossed the floor without acknowledging the crowd and went directly to get his son. The meeting room behind the stage had 4 chairs and a quality of silence that felt deliberate. Sophia sat across from Andrew without a notepad and did not open with performance. "You knew that system," she said. "Similar systems. I worked in building integration for 4 years, commercial AV and facility controls, mostly mid-scale deployments. I've seen that exact distributor configuration fail in multiple venues. Why aren't you still doing that?" He answered without inflection, the way people state facts they have had time to accept. "Extended family leave when my son was sick. When I came back, the role had been restructured. No degree on a new application most places filtered me before a phone screen. But the knowledge didn't go anywhere." "No," he said. "The knowledge stayed." She was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to set up a meeting next week. There's a contract position in our operations infrastructure team, on-site technical oversight for a facility management project. Not permanent. Evaluated on performance." Andrew looked at her steadily. "I'm not interested in being a story. The father who fixed the screen and the CEO who gave him a chance. If that is what this is, it isn't, because Ethan would see through it faster than I would, and it would do him more damage than tonight did." "I understand." It's a job. You identified a gap in my operational team. That's the basis. He studied her with the careful attention of a man who has learned to test promises for structural integrity before placing weight on them. "I'll come in," he said. Before she left, Sophia stopped in the corridor beside Ethan, who was sitting on a bench with his certificate folded in his jacket pocket. She crouched to his level. "What you did tonight, walking into a room that made you uncomfortable and staying, took more courage than most of the people in that hall will ever need." Ethan looked at her with the skepticism of a child who has been offered consolation before and found it hollow, but something in her tone, which carried no warmth performance, which said the thing as a plain fact, reached him. On the walk home, 2 blocks of silence passed before Ethan said, "She didn't feel sorry for you." "No," Andrew said. That was different. He did not call for 5 days. On the 6th morning, he called. The Reeves Group occupied the upper 14 floors of a glass tower downtown. Andrew was met by a woman named Claire and taken to a conference room where 3 people waited. A woman from HR, a man named Victor Hale who directed operational systems, and a younger engineer named Marcus who had been told to observe and had already formed an opinion. Victor was 62, methodical, and had spent 9 years building a team in the image of his own philosophy that institutional reliability came from stable processes and verified personnel, not from unvetted talent introduced on the recommendation of a single event. He communicated all of this to Andrew in 8 minutes of professional conversation, without saying any of it directly. The contract terms were fair, if modest. The scope was narrower than Andrew's actual range. He accepted without negotiating. His first 2 weeks were familiar. Peripheral work, documentation reviews, cable audits, checklists that no one in the department found interesting, and that Andrew completed with the same thoroughness he applied to everything, because careless small work was how large failures hid. He was left out of morning briefings. His suggestions were received with the expression of people who have decided in advance how seriously to take them the face of a conclusion already reached. A few colleagues were openly skeptical. Others expressed their doubt more politely through the particular courtesy of not speaking to him at all. Marcus was the first to break from the pattern. On the 3rd day, he watched Andrew locate a misconfigured load-balancing relay, logged as an intermittent fault, and left unresolved for 6 weeks in under 40 minutes. He asked quietly how Andrew had found it. Andrew explained from the principal outward, without condescension, the way he explained things to Ethan, starting from why, before arriving at how. Marcus listened with the full attention of someone who understands what they are being given. On the 14th day, running a routine audit of the research center annex infrastructure, Andrew noticed a pattern of micro-fluctuations in the backup power sequencing that did not match the maintenance schedule. He cross-referenced 3 data streams and confirmed what he suspected. The failover logic was degrading the capacitors in the primary switching array. At the current rate, the system would experience a hard failure within 3 to 6 weeks, likely without warning. He compiled the findings into a structured report and brought it to Victor Hale the following Tuesday. Victor read it and said the facility had been reviewed by the contracted maintenance provider 2 months ago and cleared. Any conclusion contradicting that review would need corroboration. "The log data is the corroboration," Andrew said. "The contracted provider disagrees. The contracted provider examined output metrics. The problem is upstream of where they looked." Victor said he would take it under consideration. Andrew returned to his workstation and understood the situation with the same clarity he brought to any system problem. Acknowledging his finding meant acknowledging that the team had missed something significant and that a man with no credentials and a provisional status had found it. The organizational cost of being wrong had nothing to do with the fault itself. That evening, Ethan looked up from a circuit board project and said, "You're doing the same thing you did before the ceremony." "I found a problem," Andrew said. "The people I reported it to don't want to deal with it." The boy turned his project over once, studying the back. "If you stay quiet, isn't that the same as the people who looked at us like we weren't there?" Andrew looked at his son for a long moment. The next morning, he documented everything formally. Time-stamped log exports, annotated sequencing diagrams, a written analysis of the failure progression and its projected timeline, a summary of his initial report, and the response it received. He sent it through the company's risk management protocol directly to the operational oversight address, with Sophia Reeves listed as a recipient under the infrastructure risk escalation clause. 3 days later, Victor Hale informed him that his contract might be better suited to a shorter timeline than originally discussed. Andrew acknowledged what he'd heard and returned to his desk. Sophia read the report on a Thursday evening. She read it twice, then called Marcus at 9:15 at night and asked him 3 technical questions. His answers aligned exactly with Andrew's documentation. She forwarded the report to her chief operations officer and requested independent verification before the weekend. The verification came back on Saturday. Monday began at 7:40 in the morning, when a failing capacitor in the primary switching array degraded past its threshold during a routine server backup cycle. The failure was precisely what Andrew had documented: a hard shutdown of the backup power sequence, a cascading failover to the secondary array, still running degraded logic, and a full power interruption to the annex servers lasting 11 minutes. This would have been containable on an ordinary Monday. The strategic partnership agreement between the Reeves Group and a European investment consortium 3 months in the making, requiring a live demonstration of the company's operational infrastructure for the visiting delegation, was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock. Ethan had been let out of school early that day and was in the lobby waiting for his father. He did not understand everything he watched unfold, but he understood enough. At 9:17, through the glass corridor wall, he saw a man in a good suit walk his father toward the elevator bank, with a hand on his shoulder and the body language of a person being steered somewhere they had not agreed to go. Ethan stood up from the bench. Sophia came through the stairwell door at 9:19, having walked down 4 flights. She went directly to the conference room and opened the door without knocking. She asked for the system logs, the maintenance audit, and the escalation record from the past 3 weeks to be pulled onto the screen. The logs showed the degradation pattern Andrew had documented, starting 41 days before today. The maintenance audit showed the contracted review that had missed it. The escalation record showed Andrew's report, time-stamped, and the response it had received. It showed 3 days of inaction that followed. Victor Hale said the pattern had been flagged internally and was already under review. Sophia asked when the review had been initiated. He said, "This morning." She said she was looking at a timestamp from 11 days ago and asked what had changed this morning. The room did not require him to answer. She placed Victor on administrative suspension pending a process review, asked Marcus to take technical lead, requested 30 minutes patience from the delegation, and walked to the lobby. Andrew was near the elevator bank with his jacket on. "I need you to fix the system you already diagnosed," Sophia said. "Not for an audience. The annex. 30 minutes. He looked at her for 4 seconds. "Where's the tech room?" He worked alongside Marcus and 2 facilities engineers. He was not the fastest person in the room, but he was the most certain, the certainty of someone who had been inside the problem before and held a map of it. He isolated the failed capacitor array, rerouted the backup sequencing around the damaged component, and restored annex power in 26 minutes. Clean, verified, no secondary faults. The consortium demonstration ran 40 minutes late and was conducted in full. Ethan had been pressed against the corridor glass the entire time, and the people passing him had looked at the boy standing alone in the corridor with his backpack still on his shoulders, and not stopped because he had the focused, self-contained stillness of someone who was exactly where they meant to be. When the tech room door opened and his father walked out with his sleeves rolled, and the quiet expression of a person who has done the necessary thing, Ethan felt something shift in his chest that he did not have precise language for yet. It was not pride in the way the word usually meant, the reflected kind that borrowed its light from someone else's moment. It was something more like recognition, like the answer to a question he had been carrying for a long time, delivered at last in a language he could not dispute. "Maybe we do belong here," Ethan said, half to himself. Andrew came close enough to hear it. He stopped in front of his son and gave him the full, direct attention he brought to problems that mattered. "We don't need to belong here," he said. "We just need to know we're not less than anyone in the room." Ethan held his father's gaze. "That's the same thing." "It isn't," Andrew said. "One depends on the room, the other one doesn't." The weeks that followed had the quality of a system coming back online after a hard restart. Deliberate, component by component. Victor Hale's departure triggered a review of deferred maintenance across the department. Marcus took interim lead. Andrew's contract was not terminated. It was renegotiated. Sophia offered him a defined role, a title that reflected function, a salary that reflected the actual market for the work, and evaluation criteria tied to performance rather than credentials. She told him plainly that the company had historically overweighted credentials and underweighted demonstrated competence, and that he was a beneficiary of that correction, but that the reason he was in this chair was the work itself. He asked for two things: the evaluation criteria in writing, and a title that reflected function rather than narrative. She agreed to both. She had run the Reeves Group for 5 years and had grown accustomed to a specific loneliness, rooms that adjusted themselves around her presence, conversations that ran slightly below their natural register because of what she represented. She had very few interactions that felt like meeting rather than managing. The higher she had climbed, the more that particular scarcity had made itself known, not loudly, not in ways she discussed, but in the specific quality of tiredness that settles into a person who is always being read rather than seen. The first time she walked past a coffee shop near Ethan's school and glanced through the window to see Andrew at a back table with a textbook open between them and Ethan, explaining something with the focused intensity of a child who has decided his audience is genuinely interested, she stopped without knowing why. Andrew was listening, not the polite performance of an adult waiting for a child to finish, but actual listening, asking questions, engaging with the answer. Ethan was speaking with the confidence of a child who has learned not to expect dismissal. She went inside. Ethan moved his notebook to make room without being asked, the way children do when they have been raised to think about the space other people need. They talked about thermodynamics, and then about Ethan's science teacher who had lent him the book, and then, at a point that could not be precisely located, they stopped talking about anything with a professional context and simply talked about a documentary Ethan wanted to watch, about whether the city had ever been quieter in any direction, about nothing that mattered formally, and everything that mattered in the way evenings that become something unexpectedly good always do. At some point, Ethan set down his pencil and looked at Sophia with the directness he shared with his father. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong somewhere?" She considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "Often," she said. "The rooms get more expensive. The feeling doesn't necessarily change. But you still go in," he said. "I still go in." He picked up his pencil. "Okay," he said, as if they had settled something important and were now free to move on. 4 months later, the foundation held a community event in the same building as the scholarship ceremony. Smaller, genuinely informal, long tables and good food, families mixed with staff. Andrew had helped design the technical setup. The systems worked because he had checked them beforehand. There was nothing dramatic in this, which was the point. Ethan arrived in clothes he had chosen himself. Dark jeans, a navy sweater, shoes a few months newer than the ones from that first night. He stood in the marble lobby and looked around with the matter-of-fact attention of a person taking inventory, not seeking permission. Near the entrance, a family had just come in, a woman with a young son of about 9, and the boy was doing exactly what Ethan had done 4 months ago, reading the room, narrowing against it, pulling himself incrementally smaller, performing the quiet calculation of whether he was allowed to take up space in a place that had not yet issued its verdict on him. Ethan saw it from 20 feet away, with the instant recognition of someone who has worn the same expression and knows precisely what it costs. He was across the lobby before Andrew had noticed him moving, and by the time Andrew reached them, his son was crouched at the younger boy's level with his hand extended and his voice in the easy, unguarded register he reserved for people he had decided to trust without requiring a reason. "The dessert table's in the back," Ethan said. "I'll show you where it is." Andrew stood still and watched his son walk away with the newcomer beside him, and thought about every distance, crossed every morning of compressed pride, every room weathered, every humiliation absorbed without retaliation for a 12-year-old boy to arrive at the place where his first impulse, in a room that had once made him feel he was not enough, was to make sure someone else felt welcome in it. Sophia appeared at his shoulder, having come in through the side entrance without announcement, wearing a gray sweater and no security detail, and the unhurried expression of someone who was here because she genuinely wanted to be, not because the calendar required it. "He went straight to them," she said. "He did," Andrew said. He watched his son crouch down to the younger boy's level, unhurried, unself-conscious, and felt something in his chest that had been waiting a long time to feel exactly this. Later, when the event had wound down to its last half hour, and the staff had begun consolidating the food stations, and Ethan was deep in a card game in the corner with 3 other children, he looked up and caught his father's eye across the room. Andrew walked closer. "I was wrong," Ethan said, "about that night." "Which part?" "When I said we didn't belong there. I was wrong about what that meant." He looked at the room around them. "We weren't the ones who didn't belong. They just didn't know us yet." Something in Andrew shifted the accumulated weight of 4 months and several years before that, not releasing all at once but reorganizing itself into something he could carry without it being the shape of how he moved. He thought about how far they had both come from that first night. He thought about Ethan in the marble lobby with his squeaking shoes and his shoulders pulled inward, already bracing for the verdict of a room. He thought about the boy in the side office watching his father work, hands pressed against the glass. He thought about that, and about Sophia saying, without any softening, "I'm not asking you to perform anything. I'm asking you to fix the system you already diagnosed." He thought about what it meant to be seen for your actual shape, by someone with no incentive to see it generously. Sophia fell into step beside them as Andrew and Ethan pushed through the revolving door into the cool of the evening. Ethan spotted a friend across the street and sprinted ahead, trusting the implicit permission of a parent who had never made freedom feel conditional. Andrew and Sophia walked at a pace that was not trying to be anything. The city was doing what cities do in the evening, settling into itself, shifting register from the day's particular urgencies to something slower and more voluntary. And neither of them was in a hurry to reach anywhere specific. She said after a while, "Are you glad you called?" "You know I am," Andrew said. A little further on, she said, "Next week. Dinner. Not a work thing." He looked at her the way he looked, at systems he was beginning to trust carefully, without premature conclusion, but with a willingness to acknowledge that the evidence was pointing somewhere worth paying attention to. For the first time in longer than he could precisely name, he let himself smile, without the small tax of caution that had come with every smile for years. "Yes," he said, "I'm free." Somewhere ahead of them, Ethan was laughing under the streetlight with his friend, the sound of it carrying back through the night air without any weight in it at all, just the clean, unheld sound of a boy who had stopped waiting for rooms to tell him who he was, and had started figuring it out for himself. There are doors that do not open to money or pedigree or the right cut of suit. They open at the moment a person stops waiting for the world to grant them permission to stand in it, and starts standing in it anyway.